You wake up one morning, look in the mirror, and for just a second, a fraction of a second, you don't recognize the person staring back. Not because something is wrong with your eyes, not because you haven't slept, but because something deeper, something older than memory, briefly surfaces and whispers, "Who is this?" That moment passes. You pour your coffee, you go about your day, but the feeling doesn't fully disappear. It trails you through your commute, through your meetings, through your conversations with people who know your name and your job and your history. You smile, you respond, and somewhere underneath all of it, you wonder why none of it feels quite like you. This isn't a crisis. It isn't a disorder. It is one of the most ancient and least understood features of the human mind. And once you understand where it comes from, you will never feel alone in it again. Psychologists have a name for the acute version of this feeling. They call it depersonalization. It's the clinical term for the sensation of feeling detached from yourself, as though you are watching your own life from the outside, as though the person doing the talking and the laughing and the working is a character you happen to be playing. Studies suggest that roughly half of all adults will experience at least one episode of this in their lifetime. Half. And yet almost no one talks about it, because it is extraordinarily difficult to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. You are here, and you are also somehow not quite here. But here's what those clinical definitions miss. Here's what the neuroscience is only beginning to catch up to. This feeling, this low-grade, chronic, perfectly ordinary sense of being a stranger to yourself, is not a glitch. It is a feature. It is what happens when the self, which is not a fixed thing, collides with a world that demands you act as though it is. Start with what the self actually is. You probably learned, somewhere along the way, that you have a self. A stable, continuous you that persists from childhood to old age, that wakes up in the same body every morning, that carries the same core values and tendencies and preferences through every stage of life. This model of the self is intuitive. It is also, according to decades of research in psychology and neuroscience, almost entirely wrong. The philosopher Derek Parfit spent much of his career dismantling this assumption. In his landmark 1984 work, he argued that personal identity is far less fixed than we believe, that the you of 10 years ago is connected to the you of today by something more like a chain of overlapping memories and patterns than by any continuous substance. The you who was 7 years old shares very little with the you reading these words. Different fears, different desires, different body, almost entirely. And yet something insists on treating both as the same person. That something is a system in your brain that neuroscientists call the default mode network. The default mode network is a constellation of regions that activate when you are not focused on a specific task, when you're daydreaming, when you're imagining the future, when you're thinking about yourself. It is, in a very real sense, the neural machinery of your inner life. And its primary job, as researchers like Marcus Reichel at Washington University discovered, is to construct and maintain a coherent narrative of who you are. It stitches together your past experiences, your ongoing story, and your anticipated future into a single continuous thread. It tells you, this is you. This has always been you. This will continue to be you. It is, in other words, a storyteller. And like all storytellers, it edits. It smooths over the contradictions. It quietly buries the versions of you that no longer fit the current narrative. It selects which memories to keep vivid and which to let fade. The default mode network does not give you access to who you actually are. It gives you access to a carefully curated story about who you are. And most of the time, you never notice the gap between the story and the reality. But sometimes you do. Sometimes the editing fails. Sometimes the narrative seems show. And in those moments, standing in front of the mirror, or halfway through a conversation, or in the middle of a Sunday afternoon with nothing to distract you, you catch a glimpse of the machinery behind the curtain. You feel the story falter. And the feeling that follows is exactly what you've been calling that sense of being a stranger to yourself. Now add to this the particular conditions of modern life. Your ancestors, not your distant prehistoric ones, but your great-grandparents, even your grandparents, lived in social environments of extraordinary stability. The same community, the same roles, the same stories about who they were and what they were for. Identity in those environments was not something you constructed. It was something you inherited. You were the farmer's son, the baker's daughter, the elder's apprentice. The role told you who you were, and the community confirmed it every day. And the gap between the inner narrative and the outer world was narrow enough that most people never fell through it. You live in a different world. You are statistically likely to have multiple careers. You will move. You will change social circles. You will present different versions of yourself in different digital spaces, curated, optimized, performing. You will hold simultaneously the role of professional, child, partner, friend, citizen, consumer, all with different rules and different emotional registers. Sociologist Irving Goffman described this as impression management, the constant exhausting work of adjusting the face you present to match the context you're in. He documented it in the 1950s. Since then, the number of contexts has multiplied beyond anything he could have anticipated. This matters because the default mode network was not built for this level of complexity. It was built for a world where your identity was stable, contextually consistent, and socially confirmed. When it tries to maintain a coherent narrative of self across 50 different roles, 50 different contexts, 50 different versions of you that each feel partially real and partially performed, it struggles. The narrative fragments. The seams show more often, and the feeling that arises from that fragmentation, that background hum of being not quite yourself, is not pathology. It is your brain's honest response to an environment it was never designed for. Psychiatrist Mark Epstein, drawing on both clinical work and Buddhist philosophy, has written extensively about this tension. He argues that the suffering we attach to this feeling comes not from the feeling itself, but from our resistance to it, from our insistence that the self should be fixed, should be knowable, should stay still long enough to be grasped. The moment you stop fighting the stranger in the mirror and start getting curious about them, something shifts, not the feeling, but your relationship to it. Consider what the feeling is actually pointing to. When you feel like a stranger to yourself, what you are really feeling is the distance between the story your brain has been telling about you and whatever is actually true. That distance is not comfortable, but it is also not empty. It is information. It is the gap between the role you have been performing and the person still underneath it. It is what happens when you have changed, genuinely, substantially changed, and your narrative hasn't caught up yet. Developmental psychologist Dan McAdams at Northwestern University spent decades studying what he called the personal narrative, the story each person constructs to make sense of their own life. He found that the people who reported the highest levels of well-being were not the ones who had the most consistent narratives. They were the ones who had the most flexible ones, the ones who could revise the story, the ones who could absorb discontinuity, who could say, "That was me, and this is also me, and both are true," without needing the two versions to resolve into a single coherent character. The stranger in the mirror is not a mistake. The stranger is a revision you haven't written yet. There is a word in Japanese, aware, that describes the bittersweet feeling of things passing, of beauty that is inseparable from its transience. The cherry blossom is most itself in the moment it is falling. Your ancestors in many parts of the world did not resist impermanence. They built entire philosophies around the recognition that the self, like everything else, is always in motion. The suffering was not in the moving. It was in the pretending to be still. You are not broken. You are between versions. Neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett at Northeastern University has spent years documenting how the brain is not a passive receiver of experience, but an active predictor, constantly building models of the world and of the self, constantly updating those models when reality fails to confirm them. The feeling of disorientation, she argues, is what updating feels like from the inside. It is not malfunction. It is calibration. So the next time the feeling comes, the morning mirror, the hollow conversation, the Sunday afternoon with no distraction and too much space to think, try not to run. Try not to fill it with noise or explanation or the reassurance of someone else's certainty about who you are. Sit with the stranger for a moment. They are not an intruder. They are the version of you that hasn't been written yet. They have been waiting, quietly, behind every role you've ever played. You woke up this morning and looked in the mirror. For just a second, you didn't recognize the person staring back. That wasn't a symptom. That was the truth, catching you off guard as it always does before the story rushed back in to cover it.